It is 6 o'clock now, so I think we can make a start. And Sian. Oh, success.
Hello there, Cordella. Hello, Sian.
Hello. Right. Okay. So I think it's just after 6, and we do have some people online. So I think we'll just make a start, and latecomers can catch up, hopefully. Right. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The first of our events focused on small firms, although I do note that in the list of booked attendees, there are 1 or 2 people from larger firms. Anyway, I am pleased to welcome Jane Malcolm, Executive Director, External and Corporate Affairs from the SRA, and Sian Hughes, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager. We're going to talk tonight about the SRA's recent report, Upholding Professional Standards. Jane is responsible for communications and corporate affairs. Prior to joining the SRA, she held a series of roles at the General Medical Council, where she had responsibility for devolved administrations, was Assistant Director in Fitness to Practice, and Assistant Director to the Chief Executive. Previously, Jane also worked at the Federation of Small Businesses, where she led UK and European policy development. Sian has worked for the SRA since 2010, advising the organisation on equality and diversity matters, and working across the legal profession to promote diversity and inclusion. Before joining the SRA, Sian worked as a solicitor for the Commission for Racial Equality, advising on individual claims of racial discrimination and compliance with the public sector equality duties. So welcome to you both, and thank you for giving up your time. Just in case there are people who are new to the subject, I'm just going to give a bit of background, and then there'll be a presentation from Jane and Sian, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. Can we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A so that they can come to us as panelists rather than in the chat box? Because if we use the chat box, then things often go missing. So please use the Q&A. So there is a sense of déjà vu about tonight's event, I have to say, because a bit of regret that we are kicking off with this topic as because one of the reasons for setting up BSN 25 years ago was because of anecdotal evidence of disproportionate regulation of Black and Asian solicitors. At the time, the Law Society, pre-Clementi, were the representative body and the regulators. And those of us of a certain age will remember going straight to the back pages of the Gazette each week to look for the names and hoping that those names weren't obviously Black or Asian, but more often than not, they were. Around 2004 and 2005, Lord Herman Ouseley produced a report on discrimination within the Law Society itself, following what appeared to be a meltdown at the thought of an Asian woman becoming president. So we have moved a long way from that. But the SRA became regulator, I think, in January 2007. And at the time, BSN worked closely with the Society of Asian Lawyers. And after discussion, the SRA agreed to commission Lord Ouseley to look into whether there was disproportionate regulation of minority lawyers, and he produced a report in 2008. The case audit findings showed that there was no disproportionality in the regulatory outcomes and sanctions applied by the SRA once a breach of the Code of Conduct was found. The review found there may be disproportionality in the early decision-making of the SRA, and that this might be compounded by the possibility of bias in the intelligence and information being received by the SRA. And the report also criticised the SRA for having failed to give sufficient priority to issues of equality and diversity. This led to, I think, the SRA implementing an equality and diversity plan, which it hadn't done at the outset. And there was an external implementation group that was set up with BSN, Society of Asian Lawyers, Association of Muslim Lawyers, SBL, and British Nigerian Law Forum, chaired by Lord Ousley, to oversee changes. The SRA commissioned a number of further studies and reviews, and they found that Black, Asian and other minority solicitors were most likely to be complained about. The SRA were fairly good at sifting out unmeritorious claims. However, those they accepted for investigation were then treated more harshly during the investigation process and had heavier sanctions applied. The most recent review was by Professor Gus John, who carried out an independent comparative case review where he actually looked at files, and his report was published in 2014. Each review highlighted overrepresentation of certain groups and made recommendations. Professor John confirmed that he found clear examples of disproportionality at every stage of the SRA's processes, and especially sanctions. Those who qualified in Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the bar were all disproportionately represented in those who have cases raised against them. At the time, those who'd been admitted to the role for fewer years were more likely to have a case raised against them. And I think that's sort of probably different to the recent figures. It's the other way around, I think. And BME solicitors more likely to have been admitted to the role for fewer years. Solicitors working in small firms were more likely to have a case raised against them, and BME solicitors were overrepresented in small firms. And so it was felt that there was a relationship between those factors. And then last, solicitors working in BME-owned firms were more likely to have a case raised against them. And again, Professor John was looking at maybe that was because of overrepresentation in those types of firms. Another issue he looked at is the high number of cases that involved financial irregularity and dishonesty. And he thought there could be external factors, including the high number of sole practitioners and small firms, and that there should be consideration of why that was. He made a number of recommendations, which included improving diversity within the SRA itself, looking into lack of access to better paying areas of practice, financial pressures, and lack of access to capital. The Upholding Professional Standards report takes a look at the diversity characteristics of the people involved in the SRA's enforcement processes. And I'm now going to hand over to Jane and Sian to talk about that work and what the SRA proposes going forward.
Thank you very much, Cordella, and thank you for giving us the background, and that fits really nicely, I think, with what we'd like to talk about, with all the challenges and perhaps potentially the opportunities it brings. So we'd like to talk about the picture we're seeing at the moment and on next steps, and then entirely open for questions, of course. And I think, firstly, we're going to get all technical and try and share some slides. I'm looking hopefully at Eva here, I think, who's going to do the needful. Thank you very much. Eva is a Black Solicitors Network colleague who is keeping us all in order. I think that's fair, isn't it, Eva? So hopefully everybody can see this. And as Cordella said, the key issue for us to look at tonight is the profile of people in our processes. And it's our enforcement processes that we're talking about, as that, of course, is very much top of mind for everybody. So perhaps if we have a look at the next slide, I'm going to dive straight in part because we published some of this material back in December, and I'm confident that many people on the call will already have had a good look at it. So every year, we, of course, like most organisations, produce a whole suite of corporate reporting. And one of the things that we started doing a couple of years ago was actually producing really
Not sure what's happened. I think Jane has frozen.
She's in the wilds of Scotland, and
yes, yeah.
Sometimes connection issues. So Jane was just.
Oh, you're right.
Sorry, shall I just carry on?
Please, yes.
Yes. So, well, Jane was just talking about the regular reporting that we do, and this year we were able to. I say this year, 2018 to 19, in a report that was published in December last year, we were able to, after a break since the Gus John report, we were able to start reporting again on the diversity data that we have. We were able to get hold of. So that reporting started again, and if we can just move to the next slide, please, Eva. I think actually this part has already been covered by Cordella's really helpful overview. And so this is the background from our point of view. We had been seeing these patterns in our data since the SRA was first established, and that was confirmed, and that's one of the data was one of the reasons why we commissioned these reports from Lord Ouseley and Pern Candola, and most recently Professor John, as Cordella's outlined. These were external reports, really thorough and detailed reports, which talked to staff, looked at all our processes, really detailed deep dive into the processes we had in our enforcement. And although it was clear that there were patterns of overrepresentation for a number of groups, in particular Black and Asian and minority ethnic solicitors, the reports didn't find any evidence of discrimination in our processes. But what they did find is there was a number of recommendations for things that we could do to improve our processes and how we worked. And as Cordella mentioned, back in 2008, actually, the SRA was only 2 years old when Lord Ouseley's report was published, and I joined the organisation at about just after that, and there was a lot of work there that we needed to do to get our approach to equality, diversity, inclusion properly embedded into the corporate strategy and the work that we did. So there's a lot of work to do from 2010 onwards, and I think we're in quite a different place now. But the pattern has been consistent, and that's, as Cordella said, was quite disappointing. That the shift we haven't seen that shift over the years. As again, Cordella's already mentioned, there were a few factors that most recently Professor John looked at and was speculating largely around for the evidence that he saw and the people that he spoke to as to the reasons for this. What we haven't done, and we'll be picking this up and talking at some point a bit later on, exactly what we're going to do about that, because we haven't looked at the reasons for this overrepresentation in a great amount of detail before. So the piece of research that we're going to be picking up and talking about later on, we'll get onto the bottom of that. But he did indeed highlight a couple of things, in particular firm size and area of practice, which may well have been some of the reasons for that overrepresentation of Black and Asian solicitors coming into our processes. If you could move on, please, Eva. I'll just talk about the actual findings. I'm going to skip this slide and get into the actual findings, and we can come back. Sorry, if you can carry on. So looking at the actual report, what we did for that period 2018-19, and we're taking the same approach, which we're currently working on for the 2019-20 year, is identify the individuals within our processes and look at those individuals reported to the SRA as compared to their proportion in the solicitors population, those who are named on investigations that we identified to take forward from those reports, and then the outcomes. And there were two paths of these outcomes after the investigation: those investigations which were upheld by an internal decision, and those cases which were upheld by finding at the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal. So we identified 4 areas where we would like to look at. So we looked at the gender, ethnicity, age, and rather optimistically tried to look at disability. But as we'll see in the findings, the reporting on disability is really quite low. The rate of declarations on that particular category is low, and has meant actually we couldn't get very reliable findings in relation to that. But there's something we're hoping that that data will be improved, so we can keep looking at the disability data going forward. And so we looked at, this isn't a cohort study because this is a resumption of annual reporting. So we're looking actually at decisions made and reports received each year, and we'll be continuing to do that. So I think as the reports come out year on year, we'll start to get a better feel for trends as we carry on. But we wanted to look at each stage. So we looked at those four particular stages: the reports, investigations, and the outcomes. And as we see, if you could move, please, Eva, to the next slide. As we move to the final stages, the numbers get really small. And our colleagues in the research team tell us that it's not really possible to identify any, confirm whether any statistical significance in the findings at those later stages. So you can see on the slide here that we identified almost 7,000 individuals named on reports that we received. About 2,500, 2,600 individuals who were then taken forward for investigation, about 300 named on cases upheld internally, and 144 went ahead to be heard at the SDT. So the numbers here are actually smaller. The people who we were able to carry on out analysis for is actually smaller than these numbers here, because we could only really look at the people who had declared their diversity data. So those numbers, as you can see at the later stages, very small, but even smaller when we looked at those for whom we had that data. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to go through for the 4 categories, just a quick highlight of the findings. So for gender, what we found was quite marked differences in the practicing population compared to the reports received, and that pattern continued through some of the outcomes. It was very roughly a 70-30 split of 70% of reports being made to us involving men compared to their a rough 50-50 split in the population, as you can see from the bar chart there. And that was fairly consistent, with a particularly noticeable uptick on cases concluded at the STT. So you can see that's gone up to 85% of cases concluded at the STT involving men. And this is quite marked, and actually you can see Jane's back. Hello Jane, are you back? I'm just going to finish talking through the findings in relation to gender, and then we'll bring Jane back. So this is one that we are I think these differences are really stark, but there's not an area that's picked up that regularly. We don't really have good reasons to understanding of why this is, and it may be a lot of people, as we've been talking about these outcomes, have speculated as to why it might be in terms of gender, but we don't really have any explanation. But in terms of yes, that's fine. Eva, we'll move on to ethnicity. Jane, did you want to jump in again? Sorry, I thought we had her back, but we don't appear to.
Eva have to let Jane back in.
Oh, yes.
Much.
Apologies for this.
Right.
All these technical issues.
Right, she's here now.
I am, but I don't know if you can actually hear me.
We can, Jade, I think. Is everyone okay?
Thanks everyone for the patience. It must be the heavy rain here in Scotland, I think, disrupting us all.
I was just, we've just gone through some of the scope of the report, and I've skipped through the gender findings and noting how stark they are really, but you know, the focus, I think, that most people, and given the history and the background of what Cordelia has gone through today, ethnicity is where you know, the focus for this evening is. Did you want to pick that up, Jane?
I'm very happy to do so, just quickly, and if I vanish again, I'm going to leave you in Sian's capable hands, I think. As Sian was just saying, the gender figures are very marked. I understand from MOJ colleagues that it reflects the figures around road traffic accidents and indeed the prison population. So maybe it's saying something quite psychological there. We're not quite sure what. And I suspect, as Sian has already mentioned, that we have a whole variety of difficulties with our data, which makes undertaking the sort of intersectional analysis that we'd like to do problematic at the moment, although we have aspirations for the future. So let's have a look at ethnicity. So in the practicing population, and I should remind everybody that this is data from the MySRA accounts. So about 18% of the practicing population is from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community. Again, recognizing the difficulty with that terminology. The figure that we get through our firm diversity data collection exercise that we undertake every 2 years looks a little bit higher than that, and that covers a wider sweep of the population, and we collect it at a different time in a different way. But you can immediately see from the slide that we have an uptick at the reports that are made to us, the reports that come in at the front door. And I think, Cordelia, you already referred to earlier studies that picked up that point, that we're seeing overrepresentation in terms of reports that are made to us. And as Cordelia said, you're all aware that my background's in medical regulation before I joined the SRA back in 2014. And that's a pattern that is widely seen across many regulators, and one that we will come back to. And I think many of you are aware that one of the things we want to do is future research into why we're seeing this picture. We then have another uptick at our decision to investigate. So we look at everything that comes in through the front door. We try and look at it as quickly as possible, recognizing the amount of stress that it causes for all concerned, including potentially the member of the public who's complained to us, but of course the solicitor who is being complained about, or indeed the firm. We make the decision as soon as we can. You can see there is a statistically valid uptick at that point. So when we make that assessment, the people making that assessment think that a higher proportion of those reports are serious and need to come through into our systems. From there on in, as Sian's already said, the numbers are really small. So there is nothing meaningful there because of the drop in numbers, in part because so many investigations do not result in a sanction internal or indeed at the tribunal, but also because, as we've indicated, our data sets are quite limited for individuals in our processes, and particularly so under certain headings. So from the point of investigation onwards, it looks as though the proportion stays roughly the same through the rest of the process. As Sian has said, this is not a cohort study. We're not tracking individuals through. This is the picture across a period of 12 months, very much in line with our wider operational reporting. I think that this is the area that we will come back to, but for completeness, I suggest that we look at the two other areas of protected characteristics that we looked at in this particular piece of work. Sian, shall I continue with the next slide, which I think takes us to age, if memory serves?
Sure.
Eva, if you're happy to move us on, thank you very much. I think as Cordella's already mentioned, the picture here, as you can see, we have quite a breadth of people in terms of age across the profession as a whole. The age categories, you can see there's a little key at the bottom. So that purple one is 16 to 34, I think. I've never actually met a 16-year-old solicitor. And again, you know, they're just the categories we use. But you can see here that the majority of reports that come into us are from people in that middle group, 45 to 54. I mentioned intersectionality earlier. Maybe that reflects what people are doing at that point in their career. We also see, and this is common again across regulators, that for people in that much older age group, the over 65s, and of course we're all under pressure to work longer these days for all sorts of reasons, and in many cases it's personal preference. You see a higher rate of representation within our processes for that older age group. And as I mentioned, that's common across many regulators. Some regulators are able to see a differentiation in the degree of seriousness of reports that come in at either end of the spectrum. What you tend to see is more serious concerns raised for younger professional groups and more serious concerns, again, raised right towards the end of people's careers. But we're not able to undertake that sort of data research, but we're keen to have a look at that type of thing in the future, of course. And lastly, I'm going to take us on to disability, if I may, and which is our next slide, Eva. And as Sian's already prefigured, this is an area where the numbers are simply not good enough for us to say anything meaningful. And we think there's a wider issue there in the profession as a whole. We've been talking to the Law Society, the LDD and various other groups about this. We think that there's real under-declaration around disability in the profession. Perhaps the real openness that the COVID pandemic experience has brought, with people feeling much more able to talk about particularly mental health issues or stress or other issues like that, might bring with it some sort of cultural change around this. But one of the things that we're keen to do is to really improve our data. And this is an area in particular where we would like to see people feeling more comfortable about declaring a disability, whether that's with their employer or with us as the regulator. But at the moment, we just don't have enough information here to be able to say anything meaningful. Indeed, it would be misleading if we attempted to do so. So that's the 4 key sets of findings that we wanted to share with everyone this evening. I think, as Sian will already have mentioned, you can see the detail in that chapter in our Upholding Professional Standards report, but alongside it, we also provided a report with much more granulated detail on each of these areas and indeed what we did, and also a report really detailing our work since Gus John's helpful review back in 2014. But looking ahead to next steps. So we've set out 6 things here, and you can see again the detail in our reports that we are planning to do next. And a lot of this involves working with other people, but perhaps the first key area is undertaking independent research, commissioning independent research. We're doing that at the moment into the societal and structural factors that are driving some of the picture that we're seeing. So we want to have a very good look in this space at 2 areas in particular. One is the overrepresentation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic solicitors at our front door. Why are we seeing a quarter of the reports coming into us being about people from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities where they are under 1/5 of the working population? And secondly, we want the independent research agency that we appoint to look at that decision-making process where we initially decide to move something from a report into our investigations. We think it's really important to look at that independently. We've done a lot of work already on this, as Sian will have mentioned, and you can see the next component on this slide here is that we should review that decision-making process ourselves and indeed enhance our ongoing quality assurance. And we've said in our business plan for this period of corporate strategy that one of the things that we want to do is to bring in some in-house quality assurance from the teams that are not involved in our enforcement work. So probably some solicitors coming in and looking at case review and that type of thing to ensure that our processes are being followed in the way that we want them to be. I've already mentioned that we want to improve our data, encourage individuals to disclose their diversity data characteristics. That's particularly in my SRA. And Sian, you need to let me know if you've already talked about all of this, but we know that we've had a real deterioration in our data in my SRA, probably since we went online with it. And in particular for younger people joining the role, our data is incomplete, but also on particular areas of protected characteristics. I've mentioned disability, but there are others such as sexual orientation, for example, and we'd like to see improvement and faith and religion and those types of areas. So we've already agreed and we're keen to get out there, watch this space. I think it will be quite soon. We've just been doing the IT work, working with the Law Society and others, and Cordello, I know the Black Solicitors Network has already said that you'd be happy to help us with this, to try and encourage solicitors right across the profession to jump into my SRA and update their diversity data characteristics so that we can report much, much better in future. We want to continue our work to support small firms. As you've already heard, I spent about 10 years with the Federation of Small Businesses. That's after I'd spent about 10 years running small businesses myself. And I know how tough it is when it's just you or you and a couple of members of staff trying to get the job done. And we've been doing a lot over the last 5 years, going out there up and down the country, now virtually, of course, to try and help small firms. We recognise that large firms have significant compliance departments and significant expertise, and indeed many of them offer that expertise to smaller firms. But we too want to support small firms. So at the moment, for example, we're doing webinars around our transparency rules, trying to help people to get that right. We've already mentioned our major reform programme. I think we've changed the landscape very significantly in the last 5 years, with, of course, the introduction of the Solicitors Qualifying Examination due this autumn for sittings in November. And built into those is a clear commitment to evaluate the EDI impacts, the broader impacts, but also the EDI impacts. And we're just about going out with some of the year one evaluation around the impacts of the standards and regulations. So many of you will see that coming into your inboxes, and please do help us and share your views when you can. And finally, we are committing to reporting annually on the diversity of people in our processes. I've already mentioned intersectional analysis. Sian and their team have wet tiles around their head at the moment, sorting out the next set of data reporting, which we're hoping to get out probably next month. And that will, I am sure, tell us the same story that we have seen here, and indeed has been the case for many years. But as we go forward, we'd like to be able to have much richer data around that. And finally, as an addendum, just to reflect just in light of mention earlier in terms of diversity for ourselves, we publish our own diversity workforce monitoring every year. And one of the things that I'm particularly pleased about is that we have mainstreamed and made EDI central throughout so much of our work. And I hope you can see it reflected in some of this. So there's some opportunities here. I think it's timely in terms of the independent research, particularly in the lives of Black Lives Matter, which I think have really shone a light on some of the societal and structural issues that we're seeing much more broadly. And also an opportunity because our board has agreed to really fund significant scale research over the next couple of years. Might take a little bit of time to report, but I do think that it's really important to have a good hard look at the underlying issues here, as well, of course, as at our processes and everything else that is going on. So that brings us to the end of our slides. Very happy to dive back into any of these areas, and of course to pick up any questions or conversation that any observations that anyone would like to share. Thank you.
Right. Let me. Thank you for that, Jane and Sian. Quite a bit to go through, and quite a lot of work to be done. And of course, BSN have confirmed that we will be assisting in whatever way we can, because obviously what we want to see is an end to that disparity. So if I can remind people, if you could send questions to the Q&A, but in the meantime, to start things off, it's two questions combined, I think, that I'm going to put to you, and I'll leave it to you to choose which one answers. But it is going back to your very first slide, where in terms of the previous reports, where the reviewers didn't actually say that they felt there was discrimination. However, I think others might disagree with the conclusion, and I think, I think the reason that that conclusion wasn't reached is each time they suggested further work needed to be done. So it's two parts really. So do you have concerns that there may be bias in the decisions that the SRA staff are making in relation to disciplinary matters? And related to that is, what is the ethnicity and gender breakdown of the staff making the decisions that are reported?
So shall I dive in on that one, Sian, and then you can add in. So I think they're absolutely spot on questions, Cordella, and of course we can never be complacent, and we can never 100% say that somewhere in our systems there isn't some degree of discrimination. You're absolutely right that nobody has put forward any evidence that there is. We don't think that there is, but the price of confidence is eternal vigilance. And I mentioned our quality assurance work. We've just rolled out, and we fully recognise that some people have doubts around unconscious bias training, but we do a lot of EDI training. We've just done a whole suite of unconscious bias training right across the organisation, actually. We think that our QA work and the guidance, and it's published on our website, that we have in place in terms of decision making is effective. But as I've already mentioned, we will be asking independent researchers to look specifically at that point in the decision making process where we decide to take something forward into our investigation work. So I think it's something we just have to keep on top of all the time. To say we think we're getting it right, probably, but there's always more to do. And you said there, Cordella, rightly, that all the reports always say there's more to do. And I think that's got to be right. And I think that the actions that we've set out going forward really reflect that we agree. We agree there is always more to do. And I'd love to say there won't be more to do in a couple of years' time, but I think it's going to take quite a long time to change the picture, particularly as we're seeing it so widely across multiple regulators. So that perhaps indicates that it's time for a good hard look at the societal and systemic factors that are playing into this, as well, of course, at the regulators' processes. And you touched there, and I mentioned it at the end of the slides on the diversity or profile of our own workforce. As I say, we publish it every year, so it's very much up there for everyone to see. So our workforce very much reflects where our offices are based, which is Birmingham and London. So as you would expect, it's a really diverse workforce across the piece. But we have also taken a little bit of time to look actually at the diversity of people in our who actually make our decisions. So thinking about our investigation and enforcement work more broadly, about 57% of people involved in that work are women, and just shy of a quarter, 23% of the overall group of people working in our investigation enforcement work are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And then when we look at the decision makers in our assessment processes, 38% are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women, and about 10% of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic men. So about half of our decision makers are white, and half are from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic community. So I hope that gives people a little bit of a feel for the picture in the office, so as to speak.
Right.
I hope that helps a bit. Sian, did you want to add anything to that? Did I get anything wrong?
No, nothing wrong. I just wanted to add, actually, because this does go back. I focused on sort of going forward and getting straight to the results when we lost you, and skipped the slide about work that we'd been doing since, from between the period when Gus John reported to now. But I think actually there are a couple of themes, really important themes, and they are quality decision making, objective, quality, fair, proportionate decision making. And so over the time we have, as the organization has evolved, to be fair, and our regulatory approach has evolved and developed into what it is now, we've focused a lot of work on making sure that we look at that decision making, and that we've been transparent, and we're publishing criteria and objective, all the criteria that we take into account, and an enforcement strategy. So I think that's a really key part of making sure that we can eliminate any biases that there might be. And it's been interesting as we've myself and my colleagues have been launching the unconscious bias training, the latest iteration of that. We've done that periodically over the last 5 or so years, equally reading at the same time lots of research about how that isn't going to change behaviours. But actually I think it is really useful, and having freshly come through a process of providing that training to staff, it does really raise awareness. It does give people an opportunity to step back from the day job and reflect on the kind of things that they see day after day, and the kind of assumptions that they might make. So we have actually, our staff has been finding that useful, and what we've done is follow that up with a workshop for staff to look at not just individual behaviours, individual decisions, but what are our processes? How are our processes working? How can we get systems and processes which help us to make objective, fair decisions? So it's been really useful to actually reflect on how we work, not just those more esoteric issues around the psychology of our brains and how we make these kinds of decisions, but to look at the environmental factors that we're working in, and use those to support the decision making.
Right. Thank you. There are quite a number of questions coming through, so I'm going to, I had several myself, but I do want us to get through the attendees' questions. And so there is one that has been asked by 2 different people, Anthony Graham, who's a BSN director, but someone else has asked almost the same question. And it's, what types of complaints or reports do you receive? What are the types of issues being raised? And then Anthony's question is, has there been an analysis of practice areas as different types of work are more susceptible to complaints or dishonesty?
I think this is one for you, Sian, as you've actually gone through the files so much.
Yes. Well, the one problem that we have in terms of getting to the detail of this is record keeping, is older systems, older IT systems, and it's been one of the reasons why there was a bit of a gap in our annual reporting. So what we haven't been able to do is systematic analysis of the decisions that we make, broken down by particular type of case, and we recognise very much that that is a key, it's a missing element, I suppose, in what we've been able to publish at this point, and it is a piece of work that we need to do, because that will you know, give some context to the type of decisions we're making. We have, as over the past year, introduced much better IT systems, and we're hoping that the data will be much improved going forward, so we'll be able to do that level of analysis. The types of complaints that we receive is just a huge range of complaints, and you know, some of the, you know, many of them, as you'll have seen from the one of the slides that we talked about, we can't take forward. You know, they're not really within the scope, or there isn't really evidential. They're not for us, they're more for the legal ombudsman around service issues. But the types of complaints are just huge. There's some obviously very serious complaints which involve you know, clearly criminal activity, which are referred to us by clients, by other solicitors, by even the police, which we have to deal with very seriously. But there's a very large range of complaints obviously around one of the big key areas for us. The key responsibilities that we have is to make sure that we protect clients, in particular client money, and we know that certain types of work, clients, law firms and solicitors are in possession and have custody of a lot of money. So all of the complaints that come in around conveyancing and things like that. So there are those kinds of complaints about handling of client money, and those tend to be the more serious ones. And I think that's the point that Gus John was looking at, where these kind of complaints, especially smaller firms, perhaps which don't necessarily do high volume conveyancing, these are the kind of complaints that come in around dishonesty. But we have things like abandonment of practice. We have lots and lots of self-reports by law firms who might have had conflict issues. We have you know, small breaches which are reported by firms, a whole range of things. I don't know if that's covered it.
Thank you. I have a short question here from Marion, but I have a long one which I think covers the same thing. So I'll give you the short question and then my long one, so that you can, or maybe my long one and then you can ponder the shorter one. I don't know which is better. But one of the suggestions for the disparities is to do with the accounts rules, fraud and dishonesty and money laundering. And this is Professor John, and it has to be said that he was speculating. There's quite a lot of speculation in his report, but he carried out an analysis of files of white respondents and Black and minority ethnic respondents. And he noted substantial differences in sanctions from to the more severe end of the sanction spectrum for Black and Asian firms. White firms were more likely to get a reprimand, while BME were fined or suspended. So my question was, does the current data show the same as this would be the same? It's the same type of offence. So how is this disparity explained? And it's the same question then from Marion. How does this accord with the outcomes for those BME solicitors being more severe than their white counterparts?
Shall I pick that one up?
Oh, I'm not sure what this means. It says BSN would like to answer this question live. So do I press something? So, answer live. Answer live. I'm not sure how that's done. So
well, perhaps Sian should dive in on this one, yes, and see where we get to.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the current research, as we've made clear, this is, as we've resumed this reporting, these are fairly high level outcomes. This is just highlight is it's just simply a breakdown of individuals at particular stages. And the numbers are so small at the sanction stage that really it's very difficult on the 1 year to draw any particular conclusions about severity of sanctions. And what we haven't done is that contextual piece at this point on looking at the types of cases that were involved in the particular cases that we've seen concluded at the usually it is likely to be the SDT. So we haven't got that piece at this point.
Right, okay, but we'll be expecting it, I think, next time around. I think. Right, this is a much shorter one. Is there Black, Asian and ethnic minority representation at the higher levels of the SRA and board level? So I think that's perhaps senior decision makers and the board.
So at the board, perhaps if I start there, we have 11 board members, and 2 of our board members are from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community. And if you look on our board website, you can see detail about Selina Allah and Vikash Shah there. So, do have a look. They're both lay members and make a really big contribution to the board. Senior management team is small. I'm part of the senior management team. We do not have Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues on the senior management team, but we certainly do in the wider leadership team. So like many organisations, same pattern as you see in law firms, large law firms, about 700 people at the SRA, very similar pattern with different patterns of gender and ethnicity at each level in the organisation, but with older speaking for myself, that is, people at the senior levels of the organisations who are well into their career, and less people from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities at that level. We're keen to do more on that, and one of the things that we're doing off the back of our last round of board recruitment is looking at what more we can do to develop a pipeline of people coming through into our senior management and our board level. And we're actually keen to work with the other legal regulators on that, because we realise that people, busy people, younger people, younger people from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities who are at a really busy time in their career may not think that coming onto our board is the right thing for them to do. But we want to try and nurture that kind of talent so that we can see more diversity, say both at board level, but also in terms of senior management. So one of the things we're particularly keen to do within the SRA, and again, something that so many law firms do, is to nurture the talent internally and move forward with promotions. And I'm pleased to say you'll be able to see when we get our latest workforce diversity report out that we're able to promote more Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues, coming through the system. It may be after my time. I'm well into my 60s now, but I'm very much hoping that we will see an increasingly diverse senior management team and indeed leadership team over the next few years.
Well, we certainly hope so. I mean, as I said, BSN, we've been around for 25 years now, and we are used to hearing the same. And the other thing we're now used to hear, particularly in terms of regulation, is that other regulators have the same problem. And it's almost as if that is an excuse for the lack of improvement, and it shouldn't be an excuse. There are, I think, probably most people, any Black or Asian person on this call will know of people who have applied for these positions and they're not appointed. And so it is not necessarily that talented people are not applying, they're not being appointed. And so we hope that that's something that will be addressed.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Cordello. I think that's absolutely right. And I think we need to do more. We need to do more on that.
There's a specific question here. Again, it's a short question. and I expect you have the information to hand. So the question is from someone anonymous, but what is the breakdown of Black as opposed to Asian solicitors? The questioner says being punished, but I think it's obviously there's different stages. It's in terms of investigation and outcome. So if we could sort of address it that way.
We're happy to do that. And I'm going to ask Sian to talk about the Black versus Asian breakdown, recognizing again that as the numbers get very small, as you go through the processes, it gets, you can imagine, very, very difficult. I wonder if before we do that, I could just pick up the use of the punished language, because it's,
that's why I rephrased. Yeah.
Indeed you did, which was very good of you. So because you knew I was going to say this, so of course fully appreciate that it feels like being punished. Of course it does, and the implications for individuals or indeed firms being closed down, but individuals losing their livelihood, for example, whether for a limited time period or potentially being struck off, or indeed getting an onerous fine, feels very punitive. Of course it does, and it can be life-changing. But for regulators, the priority is consumer public protection. So it's around protecting the public. So it's a protective jurisdiction rather than a punitive one. But as I say, completely understand how it feels to somebody who's who's in the middle of all of that. But I just thought that it was worth just making it clear that that's our approach. Sian, can you remind us whether we have meaningful information in terms of the Black-Asian breakdown?
We do in the early stages, and in the detailed report we publish that breakdown as much as we can, but the figures are for the report at the reporting stage in particular. For example, the overall figures for the Black and Asian groups is 26% of those reported are compared to 18% in the population, and for Black groups it's 3% of the population are from a African Caribbean background, with 4% that particular group makes up 4% of the reports we receive. For Asian groups it's 12% of the population and 18% of the reports. And that's as far as we can go because of the smaller numbers as we move through the system. We're not able to publish the detail for the groups broken down, the Black and Asian groups broken down.
Right. I hope that's helpful. This is I think this is perhaps a comment more than a question, because I think you might have dealt with it in your presentation. So I'll just read it. The SRA conclude that there is an overrepresentation of Black, Asian and ethnic minority, but then say there is no evidence of discrimination in their practices. So what is the view of how this is caused? More research does not feel like a response that will bring about change.
So, again, it's a great question, and it goes to the heart of the conversation tonight, I think. And I think you're right. We've touched on what we think is happening here in the presentation. So we've all seen what the numbers look like. And you've seen, for example, and Sian's just mentioned that 18% of the profession, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, but 26% in terms of reports that come into our front door. So as a regulator, we deal with what comes into us. So what's happening there, I think, is a really key area for us to commission research into. And, we don't have diversity data, for example, on people bringing complaints to us. We do when it's other solicitors, of course, but not if it's members of the public. So we don't know what that picture is telling us. And I think research into that, and I think that's probably the societal research, actually really important so that we can understand what's happening there. I mentioned a structural component to the research, and by that really I mean the sort of areas that Gus John talked about. You know, does this reflect the way the diversity of the profession works across seniority and firm size and type of practice? And does that link through to somebody else's question about the type of complaints that come into us? You know, so something there about, you know, digging away at those, and you're right, Cordelia, it was speculation from Gus John, but it's also an opportunity to have a really good hard look at that, I think, really key. Plus also looking at the decision-making point where we are seeing something that looks like disproportionality, looks like an uptick in overrepresentation. I think having an independent look at that is the right thing to do. What I think Marian's absolutely right about there is that undertaking research of that sort, although I do believe it is important, is unlikely to bring about quick change. Because if there are societal factors there, and we don't know that there are, and if there are structural factors there, and certainly there's indications that there may be, both from Gus John, but also from the profile of the profession that we're seeing, addressing those two areas will not be quick. You know, that wouldn't be overnight. And I think I mentioned when I managed to get back on Zoom that some of these areas, the intention of the research would be to absolutely make recommendations about what more can be done. We've said that in terms of taking actions of that sort forward, very likely would have to be in collaboration you know, with others. And I suspect that that will be the case without prejudging any of this. We've kept the research spec completely open. We've asked for you know, calls of interest, expressions of interest. We're not defining what people should be looking at here or how they should be doing it. We're pointing them at those areas, but we don't want to set the scope in such a way that it may prefigure or influence the answers, because I just don't think that's the right way of going about it. So I hope that helps a bit. Sorry, Sian.
Yeah, and if I can just come add to that, I think the research will help us, because we haven't looked at this before, will help us understand some of those structural issues. And I think, you know, Professor John is right to look at the structure of the profession, and it is absolutely stark on how the structure of the profession in terms of where Black and Asian solicitors are working. We know for women, for example, the broad issue is progression across the piece, but for Black and Asian solicitors, it at the top level, it doesn't look like there's any issue, because there's around 19 or 20% of solicitors in the profession are from a Black and Asian background, and around the same are partners. So you think, well, no progression issue there. It's not like women at all. But it's incredibly stark. Where are Black and Asian solicitors working? And in our most recent survey, which we did in 2019, we found that the largest firms, 50 plus partners, have the lowest proportion of Black and Asian partners. It's only 8% compared to sole practices, where it's 36% of partners are from a Black and Asian background. So I think that has to be something you know, that's at the bottom of this, and that is growing. In fact, I think we found out the rate of increase in Black and Asian partners in one partner firms from over the last 5 years is around 38%, which is more than twice that of firms with 50 plus partners, which is around 14%. So that is getting worse, and I think this brings us to the point about our regulatory approach, and it's two things. It's what is our regulatory approach doing to try and address some of those issues, and there's a whole range of measures that we've introduced to try and provide more flexibility for where solicitors work. And I think over time we're monitoring that. As Jane mentioned, it's part of the work that we're doing to monitoring the impact of that. So is that going to help change the profile of the profession and where people are working? But it's also about our approach to enforcement. We've made that clear in our enforcement strategy. And when I first joined the organisation, we were very much, it was much more about identifying rule breaches, taking regulatory action, end of story. It was very process based, and it's a very different feel when I first joined the organisation than now. And so for example, the accounts rules, solicitors accounts rules, that's something we've highlighted as one of the, if you call it, risk areas where people are more vulnerable to complaints, and that's obviously an area where we're very interested in to make sure that we're protecting client money. But where we can, we have taken away some of the more prescriptive, unnecessarily prescriptive rules to allow people greater flexibility. So people aren't being tripped up and brought into our process when actually there isn't really good reason for that. So those kind of things, that's account rules is one example, but our approach is intended to be much more risk-based, so that we're not bringing people into our processes and that kind of thing. I mean, we brought these rules in the enforcement strategy, and the big changes in our rules was a long time in the making, and all brought in with these standards and regulations in the end of 2019, and then we have a process of evaluation of that, which we've been involved in, to make sure that we're picking up some of these issues and how that plays out in what we see coming through the door in reports. But that will be a process that I think we've got plans for a 1 year and a 5 year and a 10-year evaluation, so they do take time to come through. So I think that will help it. I absolutely won't provide immediate solutions, but we are trying to get to the bottom of some of these issues over time, so that we can refocus work if necessary.
You've spoken a lot about, we've spoken a lot about practice type and practice size, and the question, and there have been a few questions around that. And I appreciate you're the regulator and your role is to regulate. What do you think our representative body, the Law Society, could be bringing to this?
So again, I think it's a great question. And I think in terms of supporting firms, I think that's something the Law Society does a great deal of. And that's really helpful through their professional support. And I might not be getting the language right, probably because I don't have to actually do it. But I think they provide a huge amount of professional support materials. And of course, it's specialist committees really give an opportunity for people's voices to be, heard. We are working with them on key areas, doing a lot of work together on areas like EDI. I've already mentioned the data collection piece, where I think there's a really shared commitment to trying to get this right. But also, you mentioned yourself, Cordella, anti-money laundering, for example. And again, that's an area where there's a whole range of requirements on law firms in place in AML legislation, not in our regs, but in separate, UK government legislation driven actually by a global approach to anti-money laundering. And I think the Law Society does a great job, and we're working with them really closely. Many of you will have seen our people on platforms in a whole series of recent webinars that we undertook with the Law Society a little bit earlier this year. So there's areas like that where I think the Law Society is absolutely in point position to help people and provide them with support and information.
There's a question, I'm trying to, the question has put some, I think Angela Bennett has put something in the chat box and also the Q&A, which I think are related. So I'm just trying to work out what the real question is. So I'm going to read both because it's talking about guidance, and I'm not sure what guidance that is. But is the guidance sufficiently written to definitely deal with the facts of each case, as there may be cases where the guidance fails people on the facts and can lead to adverse outcomes, and thus the guidance needs reviewing. And then the question is, when is the guidance reviewed? And then there is the question in the chat box asks about people of colour being involved in that review process, or the opportunity for that.
Okay, so I think the guidance is the guidance to our decision makers and guidance that we provide for our staff in investigation and enforcement. But I'm sure Angela can come forward in the Q&A and let us know if we've got the wrong end of the stick on that one. It's published on our website. We're very transparent around all of this. The enforcement strategy that drives our guidance and our detail was, as Sian said, really widely consulted on with large firms, small firms, and a whole range of diversity groups. We provide we call it enforcement in practice, specific areas where we pick up topical issues and set out the kind of factors that we would consider if issues are raised around that. So obvious examples, use of social media, that type of thing. Discrimination in social media is you know, a really difficult area, if I can put it like that. So there's a lot of material out there at the moment, which we're extremely happy to have comments on at any point in time. Quite a lot of it's been introduced reasonably recently as our standards and regulations and enforcement strategy came into effect, something over a year ago now. We do keep these things under review. I'll have to get back to you, Angela, with the next review date, but we tend to work on the basis that we review it. We have things like a technical forum that reviews these things internally on a rolling basis. And for example, people on the call may recall that the wider conversation around sexual harassment in the workplace and sexual harassment in the legal workplace and the appropriate or the use of potentially inappropriate clauses in non-disclosure agreements led to a much wider conversation about firms' reporting obligations, and we consulted on and put out there further guidance for the profession, but also for our own people around dealing with that type of thing, around reporting obligations. And it's a good example of where we keep these things under rolling review.
And just to add in relation to the guidance point, it is, our approach is principles based, and so we, even though we do have guidance and we do have objective criteria, it is principles based, so that does allow for fact-based variations in the approach that staff are taking, but that produces, I think, and that leads to other challenges around consistency in an organisation dealing with as many cases as we do with as many staff, and so the consistency issue is always a challenge for us, and we've got a whole range of ways of trying to address that. For example, when we start to see patterns of particular cases come in, we just use the language of bring together within a specialist team a cohort of particular cases which are similar, which allows staff to talk to each other more. We monitor those cases a little bit more. We have conversations between caseworkers to make sure that there's consistency across those. So I think the focus on the guidance, it is there for both our staff, but also equally for solicitors to understand kind of how we approach the decisions, but they're not so rigid as to lead to fixed outcomes in that sense. And I don't know if it's a useful point. I think we've got our understanding right about the particular point that you were making, Angela, but just kind of made me also think about the piece of work that we're doing specifically around our reviewing our processes, in particular the assessment decisions, which we on our evidence highlighted that particular uptick, in particular for Black and Asian solicitors. So those assessment decisions, the work that we're doing in relation to that, is going to be commissioned by an external organisation. We're not going to be marking our own homework, and we will be making sure that I've seen the tender document. Equality is hugely front and center of that, so we'll be making sure that we have a diverse team of people working on that particular piece of research, and equally this will be we're in the process of setting out a stakeholder reference group, so that people from groups like the BSN and others will be involved in the piece of research, and we'll be talking to them, and there'll be a lot of engagement that we expect to be designed and then carried out over the next year or so as this research is proposed and carried forward.
Thank you. sort of still staying on guidance and regulations, I suppose. It was a question that I was going to ask originally. So I'm just going to pose it, not necessarily for answering tonight, but just in terms of the work going forward. That outcomes-focused regulation was supposed to focus on risks and outcomes rather than compliance with detailed rules, and so maximize fairness and consistency and eliminate potentially discriminatory practices. That included constructive engagement. Why has that not worked? So that's my question generally, but I'm going to go back to, because Joe, who's one of the directors of BSN, I think he's put the question up in two different places, so I will ask it. Right, so the SRA is trying to be meticulous and fair in processes so as to eliminate bias. It's quite a long question. Professor John talked about the particular challenges that small firms and solicitors face that might explain the disproportionate reporting and sanctioning. The report recommended that the Law Society and SRA should conduct a mapping exercise to gain a comprehensive understanding of those challenges. And he says, I know you are undertaking some research, but in the old days, Joe and I are the same generation. As part of the Law Society finals, we did ethics. And he says, I don't know if that is still offered, but is there merit in asking that the SQE should include a module that tackles those challenges and issues that present pitfalls to small BME-led firms and solicitors?
So I'm happy to dive in there, Sian, if that's okay. Firstly, I just wanted to say that if it's okay with you, Cordella, we're very happy for Sian or I's email addresses to go to anyone if we've not got the question right, or if anyone's got anything further they'd like to come back on. I'm really happy to pick up with anyone directly on anything that comes to mind. But for Joe, I think your question is around ethics, and that's clearly very dear to all regulators' hearts. So you're absolutely right. The SQE will have ethics questions throughout it, but they will be blind ethics questions. We're not going to be signalling that this is a question about ethics. It will rather be questions that incorporate a good understanding of ethics, or that will test people's understanding of ethics in application as a solicitor. And we think that's really key, you know, absolutely. Again, something I know quite a lot of professions do that, and we've got that hardwired into the SQE. The SQE itself is an assessment like the old Law Society finals. We don't prescribe the content of the courses or the areas that people study in order to actually sit the SQE. And that's one of the reasons why we have ethics questions throughout. Both components actually of the SQE assessment as I understand it. So I hope that that helps. Outcome focused regulation. I should flag that the picture we've just looked at is 1819. We have, of course, undertaken our major standards and regulation review recently, which again gets rid of a whole range of the prescriptive detail in there. And as Sian has said, it's very much around principles. We are not trying to trip people up on technicalities or anything like that. It's really, the big serious stuff. And you mentioned engagement there, and our early resolution team. So the team that deals with that early decision making, one of the things that they do is pick up the phone and try and work out what's happening really quickly before something gets too far in, gets into investigation. But also in our more detailed Upholding Professional Standards report, you can see that a very big, a significant proportion of the material that comes into us is resolved by engagement with the solicitor or the firm, which we think is right and proper. This is about helping people to get it right, not punishing people. That can be quite difficult for members of the public who've brought something that's really important to them to us, and they may see that as us resolving it with the firm. but we think it's the right thing to do. So the very happy to send anyone details, as I say, of how that works and the significant numbers that get resolved at that early stage. And you might have seen in one of the slides we put up earlier, that very fast fall off in terms of numbers of things we look at that actually go through to sanctions. There's a big gap there, and a lot of that is about engagement and getting things sorted out without going through to sanction of any sort. So I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you. That's pretty comprehensive. Thank you. There's still questions coming through, so I'm trying to see what we can get through in the time we have. I've got 10 minutes. This is a short one. Anonymous. Are there targets for your staff, i.e. the number of investigations they undertake and progress?
No, we don't have targets for our staff in terms of the number of investigations they progress. We do have KPIs in terms of timeliness. So we want people to progress things as quickly as they can. We make commitments to solicitors and complainants about when we will get back to them on, how their matter's going. And we expect people to do that. And that's very much around, people knowing what's happening, helping to manage stress. As I mentioned, we do know how difficult it is, but we don't have targets in terms of volumes of processing material, but we do ask our people to try and move things through in a timely way. And again, I think that has to be right. We have, rightly, people say to us investigations can take too long, and they can take too long, particularly if there are, for example, other matters going on, employment tribunal cases. Somebody mentioned some areas around that in a question, or police matters, or something that's already in the courts around fraud, for example, and that type of thing. You can see that really extends the length of an investigation, taking it through to sanction, or some of the big cases that go across many jurisdictions can take a long time. But we're very keen to try and limit that as much as possible.
An interesting question here. I'm not sure if it's a sympathy question or a cynical question, but Ngozi Adi asked, does the SRA have enough money for all this research?
So thank you very much. It's a really good question. As you all know, the SRA is funded by the profession. So perhaps the question should be, does the profession have enough money for all this research? So for us, as ever, we go out and consult on our business planning and on our budget. We work very hard to run a tight ship in financial terms. We think doing this is really important. So for us, it's about prioritising within our budget effectively. So in order to do this, we look at all the potential research areas that we could look at, and we invest money where we think it really matters and where we think it will make a difference. And I think that's absolutely the case for this piece of work. And there's a partner piece of work looking at the performance of Black, Asian, minority ethnic candidates in professional assessments. And you'll all have seen year after year in the LPC, the GDL and others, that there is poorer performance for people from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities sitting those assessments. So we have a partner piece to this piece in terms of enforcement and overrepresentation that will look at why that's happening as well. So those two pieces I think are really key. So I hope you'll all agree that it is worth investing some money in doing this and doing it now.
We've just got a few more minutes. It's another question from Marion. I'm just going to read it because, again, I think it's quite specific, and I don't know. I'm not sure if I think you will probably understand better than I, so I'll just read it. If a BME solicitor states in their defence that discriminatory factors are the reason why the issue has not been resolved, how did the SRA make sure that this issue is dealt with when the matter is heard? I suppose my question is about the interplay between the Equality Act and grievance and disciplinary procedures, and how it is deployed in holding up equality and diversity practices.
So I would defer to Sian on, as the lawyer in our part of the room, at any rate, on the detail of the Act and so on. But just as a general point, of course, aggravating and mitigating factors are all absolutely in there. One of the reasons that our investigations take some time is because we look at all of that, because people have lots of opportunities to make representations and to explain what has happened. We're very alive to issues around discrimination. We're very alive to understanding why a complaint has come through to us. I've already touched on how, because it happens, quite a bit actually, that people will come to us in parallel with issues going to an employment tribunal, for example, or some other forum of that sort. So, really key areas for us that we actively manage. Sian, I don't know whether you want to mention anything particular about Marian's last sentence there.
I'm not fully sure I follow, but I think I understand it as meaning, are we looking at the background and the causation for some of the behaviour that might have brought somebody within the scope of our processes? And I think you've addressed that point, Jane. I'm not sure if I have too much additional. Maybe just to add one particular feature, which I think we've seen in recent years, and we've responded by sort of setting up one of these cohorts of cases, is the cases where behaviour has been influenced by potentially the particular culture in a firm, and that might include bullying and harassment. It might mean undue pressure on solicitors in the way they work within the firm, and so that is something that we've picked up, and we've seen, I wouldn't say necessarily a pattern of cases, but we have seen cases coming in, and think that merits a better look. So we're pulling those cases together so we can try and understand what those patterns might be. And there's a couple of pieces of work we are lining up for this year. One is looking at the culture within law firms, and what how so-called toxic cultures might impact on individual solicitors coming up before us and getting caught up within our processes, and looking in positive terms at how law firms can implement and create positive cultures, which helps support the solicitors working for the firm. And there's also a piece of so there's some guidance that we're looking at the moment about putting out, and also some a piece of research or a review, a thematic review, talking to law firms about this. So it's a little bit tangential to the question, I think, but we're very much focused on what causes behaviours and those type of things that cause behaviours. Hope that helps.
Okay, I'm just going to ask one last question. Again, it's a short one, but maybe has a longer answer. There are several questions outstanding, though. What I would propose, if you don't mind, if I sent them to you, and we could for a response, and we can find out get a way of sharing those with the participants. Because there are a few more detailed ones, but this one, anonymous. But are the SRA principles impact assessed for equality's purpose?
So in short, yes, they were, they are, and as part of our evaluation around the standards and regulations, as we've mentioned, we're undertaking the first year tranche of that. Looking at the equalities impacts will be really fundamental to that.
Sian, is there anything you wanted to? Right.
No, I mean that in the consultations, there are many layers of consultations that we've gone through to introduce the principles and everything that sits below the principles. You'll find the equalities impact assessment there, but with such a huge, wide-ranging change in our processes, it's very difficult to assess impact. You can assess what you think might be. So I think the key actually to that is the monitoring. so that's why it's really, really key, and the monitoring work, that huge pieces of work that we've got, both for the implementation of the SQE that we talked about earlier, but also the regulatory processes. That monitoring will be absolutely clear, and this annual reporting is a key part of that.
Right. I think we don't have time for any more questions. As I said, some of them, I think that they are comments, but also quite interesting and useful in terms of your ongoing work. And so I will have those sent through. I'd reiterate that that BSN is now re-engaging in terms of the issue of disproportionate outcomes in regulation, and we've had meetings, and we will continue those meetings with regards to the research. And as I said, some of the points that have been raised tonight I think have been really useful, and will help if that feeds into the research in terms of actually trying to find out what the causes are, because without all the pieces of work so far have essentially told us what we know, that there is disproportionate outcome, and we know that, and we feel that. And we need to know the cause, because if we don't know the cause, we're not going to be able to fix it. And so that's really what has to be honed in on going forward. So I want to thank you both for giving up your evening, and also for the frank exchange of information that I think we have had this evening. And I really want to thank the attendees as well, that they have, as I said, asked some really interesting questions and have engaged. And so it is clearly an important subject. I would ask that they actually keep in touch with BSN, so that when we do speak to the SRA, it's not just Cordella or Anthony speaking to the SRA. We are speaking as a voice for solicitors, the profession, who are affected by this issue. So thank you all, and good night.
Can we just say thank you to you, Cordella, for some great sharing, and to BSN for making us so welcome, and to thank you all the attendees for such strong and on-point questions. Really good discussion. Thank you. Thanks, Cordella.
And I should say to people, if there are any more questions, specific questions, if they direct them, the email address has just gone up for BSN, and we can forward them through, but also, as I said, take them forward in terms of the work that BSN is doing. Okay, thank you. Good night. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone.